Welcome to the Advanced MaxDiff Topics webinar, hosted by your friends at Sawtooth Software. My name is Megan Peitz, and I am the Ingenuity Ambassador at Sawtooth Software. What that means is that I'm responsible for keeping our current customers satisfied, as well as getting the word out about our products and services. If you ever have any questions about Sawtooth Software or your specific licenses, feel free to reach out. Now, while I'm going to help moderate this webinar and answer some of your burning questions, it is Keith Shun, the Senior Vice President of Sawtooth Analytics, who will be leading the webinar. Keith has nearly 30 years of marketing science experience, and many of you have seen him present at the Sawtooth Software Conference, the Art Forum, and many other industry events. He has lots of respect for the MaxDiff technique and was even willing to let me share that he's been using it since he read about it in 1993. Take it away, Keith.
And here's the presentation. So welcome everyone. Here's the, we've chosen sort of a selection of advanced MaxDiff topics. We had several topics to choose from, and we picked three that we thought would fit in the length of today's presentation. So, and we're going to very briefly review what MaxDiff is and why we like to use it. And then we're going to talk about our three advanced topics. We're going to talk about something called anchored MaxDiff. We're going to talk about a problem that I've seen come up again and again and again, which is the problem of large numbers of items. Because as soon as we have a method that we like, what we find is that our users or our clients want to push it to its limits and then push it to those limits. And as soon as you make an exception, push it to even new limits. And so that's become, I think, a pretty burning topic for us. And then I want to talk about different varieties of best-worst scaling. MaxDiff is just one kind of best-worst scaling, and there's a couple of others that have some interesting benefits that are worth knowing about. So here's the brief review. In the ideal world, all of our respondents would look like Socrates. Okay, they would answer a question. When we gave them a battery of rating scale questions, they'd answer something like this. They'd tell us what's important to us and to them, and they would tell us what's not important to them, and they would tell us everything in between. However, if you've ever looked at how respondents answer rating scale data, you'll find that they don't always answer like Socrates. In fact, a lot of respondents will just use the top half of the scale. Everything will be a 3, 4, 5. And a fair number of respondents, up to, I think the highest I ever saw was maybe 12% in a survey. 12% of my respondents answered like this, like Bubba here, that everything is extremely important to them. Well, that's nice for Bubba that he values all this stuff, but as marketing researchers, this data is useless to us. It's as useless as if he left the questions blank, or if he wrote all 3s or all 1s or all anything else, because it doesn't allow us to discriminate among the items. We can't prioritize these items in any way when it comes to putting together our ice cream product. So Bubba's given us useless data. And that's why we like MaxDiff scaling, because it's MaxDiff scaling, which is a variety of best-worst scaling, is used for measuring importances or agreement or basically any other psychometric property with respect to a list of items. And it does this by forcing people to make trade-offs. So whether you're Socrates or Bubba, whether you're male or female, whether you live in a country that tends to agree with everything or you're part of a culture that tends to disagree with everything, you have to answer the question the same way. You have to tell us which one thing on this list is most important to you and which one thing on this list is least important to you. And I should mention that it doesn't just have to be importances, right? So if we were doing a study, this is the season where people are going to start doing a lot of political surveys. So if we had 4 planks on a political platform and we wanted to see which one people agree with most and which one they agree with least, we could force them to make these kinds of trade-offs. If we had a set of colors that we wanted to put in our packaging and we wanted to find out what color people like best and what color they like worst, we could use MaxDiff to measure that too. So it's a general measurement technique anytime we've got a list of items that we want to prioritize. And because we force these trade-offs, we're guaranteed to get a really good prioritization on the back end, more powerful than we get from rating scales because of people like Bubba. Okay, So that's our very brief introduction to MaxDiff. Now we'll start talking about the three advanced topics. And by the way, we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. So please do type your questions in if you've got them, and we'll get as many as we can when the session ends. And any that we haven't gotten to, we'll address by email. So just a reminder about that. So the first of these topics is called anchoring. And if you remember, if you think about the way MaxDiff does its scaling, what our respondents are doing by giving us one best thing in each set of items and one worst thing in each subset of items, they're making relative judgments. So we're not really finding out if the items are good or bad. We're just finding out which one is better than the rest and which one is worse than the rest. So it's entirely possible we could end up with two respondents with the same MaxDiff scores, and we wouldn't know, do these two people really have the same set of preferences, or do they really like chocolate and like vanilla less and strawberry the least? Does that mean they have the same set of preferences, or could it be that one person hates all three flavors and the other person loves all three flavors? If you're doing MaxDiff scaling, not only to prioritize, but to draw a line in there and say, the products of the things that we're testing above a certain point are good, and the things below that point are bad. If we want an objective point of reference, we're going to need to anchor our MaxDiff data, and that's what this section's about. So the idea here is that we've got three objects, C, B, and A, and we know that that respondent 1 and respondent 2 in this example prefer them in exactly that order. They like C better than B and B better than A. But we don't know objectively, are C, B, and A all three high utility things? Are they all three low utility things? Is C acceptable but B and A not? We don't know any of that information because with MaxDiff, all we've got is, while we've got very powerful and discriminating information, we've only got relative information. And so in the course of a couple of different Sawtooth Software conferences, a couple people recommended ways of adding an anchor in. And one of them was in an offhand comment at one of the conferences. Someone was mentioning this problem, and Jordan Louviere, the fellow that invented MaxDiff scaling, said, "Hey, I've got a way to do that," and we call it Louviere's indirect method, or his indirect approach. And the way that works is we ask a second question. After each MaxDiff question, we ask respondents, "Hey, you just evaluated these four items, and you told us which one's the best and which one's the worst. Is it the case that they're all really good, or they're all really bad, or is it the case that they're a mix of good and bad?" And then you could take that data and use it. There's a more direct way of doing it. My former colleague, Kevin Lattery, came up with an approach, and he said, you don't really have to ask that follow-up question and come at it indirectly. You could just give people almost a checklist and say which of these things are good and which of these things are bad, and use that with your MaxDiff. So here's what Lattery's direct approach looks like. It really is just a checklist. Let's say we had a MaxDiff study with 8 attributes in it, or 8 items. It's these 8 attributes of ice cream flavors, the example that we've been using so far here. And what Kevin suggests is that we could just have people do a question like this, tell us if each item is important or not important, and then we'll integrate that. We'll build that into the experimental design for the MaxDiff. We'll code it appropriately so that when we run our MaxDiff, we'll have MaxDiff utilities for all of the items relative to an anchor. And the anchor is going to be the dividing line between important and unimportant. And so if we scale it appropriately, we'll have MaxDiff utilities, and the positive ones are going to be above that line, and the ones with negative scores are going to be below that line. So now we've got the powerful discriminating MaxDiff scores, plus we've got an anchor in there that separates good from bad. Jordan's way is a little bit more complicated, but it's also not quite as obvious. I mean, if you look at Kevin Lattery's question, it's really obvious what's going on here. Respondents don't have to think very hard to see through our intent there. Jordan's way is a little bit different, but it's also a little bit more time-consuming, because after each of our MaxDiff questions, and this is a really small study with 8 attributes, right? If it had had 40 attributes, it would have had a lot more questions, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. But with just this small study with just 5 MaxDiff questions, after each of those MaxDiff questions, we have a follow-up. And the follow-up question is, considering just the 4 items above, would you say that none of these are important to me, all of them are important, or some of them only are important? And so that's the way that the indirect scaling works. And again, we take that data, we integrate it in a particular way, we code it up properly to fit in the MaxDiff scaling, and when we run the analysis, we end up with a utility for each of the 8 items, each of the 8 attributes, plus the anchor, so we know where the 0 point is. And then we can rescale everything relative to that 0 point so that the good attributes, the ones that are above that anchor, have positive utility, and the bad ones have negative utility. Just some things to think about. If you're going to use Louviere's indirect approach, we found that you really don't want to use any more than about 4 items per set. If you included 5 or 6 or 7 items per set, that increases the likelihood that some of them are going to be good and some of them are going to be bad. And it just so happens that in the course of running this analysis, that's the least useful response for reliably identifying where the anchor is. So we'll get a better, we'll be able to pin that anchor down more accurately if we keep it to no more than 4 items per set. So there's been some comparative, as you'd imagine, there's been some research on research about these 2 methods to try to figure out which one is better and when. And it turns out that Lattery's direct approach is a little bit faster for respondents. And that's not a surprise. It's 1 question, it's a checklist, as opposed to being a dual response question that follows every one of the MaxDiff questions. We found that some researchers, Horn, Rayner, Baker, and Leonard, found in 2012 that the location of that anchor, that threshold, is lower when you're using Louviere's dual response method than when you're using Lattery's direct approach. So what that means is if you're using Louviere's indirect method, more of the attributes are coming out as important because the anchor is lower. It has more things above it. Whereas the direct approach allows fewer attributes to pass that threshold, and more of them are on the minus. More of them will have minus signs if you're using Lattery's direct approach. The nice thing is that SSI Web handles both of these scaling options. It's a pretty simple matter to add either of these to your MaxDiff survey, and you don't have to worry about all the nasty coding thing that happens because it's all automated for you, which is nice. Of course, nothing comes for free, and whether you do Lattery's direct method or Louviere's indirect method, either way your questionnaire is going to be a little bit longer. One thing that people pretty quickly realized, and this was again some of the research done by Horn, Rayner, Baker, and Leonard, was that although we're not using a rating scale, what we've effectively done by bringing in the anchor is that we've reintroduced scale bias, the fact that some people use rating scales differently than other people. And what they found at this chart on the upper right here is a really neat thing that they found. They had about a dozen items and a threshold, or the anchor score there, and you can see the anchor's in the bolded line. The threshold, it's labeled there, is the bold line, and you can see that in different countries, that anchor's in different places. So it's not a constant. So here we had our MaxDiff. We did it to get rid of scale use bias, and to some extent we've brought it back in here because you can see that, not surprisingly, if you've done multinational research, you've probably noticed that people in Germany are very demanding, and it's kind of hard to get a good rating on a new product concept among a German audience. On the other hand, among Japanese or Indian audiences, it's kind of hard to find a concept they don't like, and that is reflected very well here in this MaxDiff data. The anchor in Germany was so high that none of the items were above the threshold. All of them had negative coefficients. They were all bad. Whereas for India, almost everything was good. Everything was above the threshold. So to some extent, we've reintroduced scale use bias in this. We still have the powerful discrimination because we're still forcing people to make choices, but the anchor is something that can change from one culture or one country to the next, or from one group of respondents to the next. So the scores aren't as absolute as we might have hoped. And there's a recommendation about this too. If a lot of people do MaxDiff scaling and then they do cluster analysis to find segments, it turns out that the location of that anchor has a very powerful effect on your cluster analysis. So we recommend that you keep it out, that for cluster analysis, you use the relative MaxDiff scores without the anchored scaling, and then maybe when you show your results, you could show the anchored results. Rather than including the anchored data in your cluster analysis, it's really likely to mess things up. So there's a bit of advice about that. And that brings us to our next topic, large numbers of items. I mentioned that this is what happens when we come up with a neat research method and people start pushing the limits. So I remember the first couple times I did MaxDiff studies, I was using 10 and 15 items. And then my client started saying, well, you know, we've got an item set that has 30 or 40. Can you do that? And I said, sure, I knew how to do that. And within a couple years, you know, we were doing item sets that had 80 or 90 or 100 attributes or items in them. And so then it becomes a real problem, and we have to wonder, how can we do that many? Because in practice, we'd like to show each item to each respondent at least 3 times. That's what we need to do to get stable HB utilities. If we're using hierarchical Bayes, which we ordinarily are to estimate our models, we get stable individual respondent level data if each respondent sees each thing 3 times in the course of the interview. So, however, when you start to get large numbers of items, how are we going to do that? Because if we had even 50 items, well, we could show 30 MaxDiff questions per respondent and 5 items a set, and maybe we could get away with that. But if we had 90 items, do we really want to ask each respondent 60 MaxDiff questions with 4 items in a set? And what do we do if we have 200 items? So obviously that's a bit of a problem, because I haven't found the upper limit of what my clients are willing to ask for, and so it would be neat to have a solution for this. So here's some possible solutions, and a few of these we'll talk about in more depth. We could just ask more questions, right? We could say, hey, if this is really important to you, sure, we'll ask 47 MaxDiff questions so that we can accommodate your 90 plus attributes or whatever, but you're going to have to get everything else out of the questionnaire. It's pretty much going to have to be screener and MaxDiff and nothing else, because we're not really going to have time, and the respondent's really not going to have the capacity to do any more than that. So that's kind of an infrequent solution. I don't see people do that one a lot. Sometimes we can be content with aggregate level models. You know, we've got a large sample size, say, or maybe we don't need respondent level data. Maybe we're perfectly content to say, hey, you know, we've got 3 segments of people. We're gonna collect a sample of 900. We're gonna do 300 per segment, and within those segments, we don't need to look at anything within the segments. We're only going to compare those 3. In that case, we could get by with running an aggregate logit model. We don't need HB, and so we don't need 3 items per set anymore. Maybe we can get away with that. But ordinarily, we want to retain the advantages of hierarchical Bayes analysis. We want to have that respondent level data. And so there's 5 methods here that we'll talk about momentarily that allow us to retain the HB analysis. I've already spoken a little bit about asking lots of questions. I have seen a few studies where we did this. I did a physician study with 94 items in 47 choice sets of 6 items each, and a couple of other fairly large studies. And in those, I was able to talk the client into not doing anything but the MaxDiff, and they produced utilities that had face validity. And you know, when I had known segments, I was getting credible differences among those segments. So it looked like it worked reasonably well. And still, I'm left with the feeling that when we're asking people 40 or 50 MaxDiff questions, we really can't be getting their best thoughts out of them. We just have to be fatiguing them. It just doesn't seem possible that we could be doing anything else. I mentioned we could do aggregate level models. If we don't need that to worry about respondent heterogeneity, if we're not going to look at anything below that, we could, you know, we could get by with if we had a large enough sample, we just do it for each of our segments. Or sometimes we don't even have segments. Sometimes we just want to know the answer. I've done a few studies in the past year where we don't even want to look at segments. We really just want the answer for a sample of people. And then we don't have to worry that everybody sees each item 3 times. And we can get away with asking people a smaller number of questions even when we've got a larger number of items. If we want to retain hierarchical Bayes, though, we could go with an adaptive approach. And so my colleague Brian Orm wrote a paper in 2006 where he described something, I guess you could describe it as being a tournament-style MaxDiff. It was adaptive within respondents. So early in the survey, it would find out what was more important to respondents and what was less important just in their first few MaxDiff questions. And then it would focus the later MaxDiff questions on the winners from the earlier MaxDiff questions. So that was a way to do it. And more recently, at a paper that was presented at our conference earlier this year, there was sort of a cross-respondent adaptive version that draws on crowdsourcing. So basically, the first few respondents that come into the survey, we take their data, we analyze it, we notice what's important to them, and then we do something called importance sampling. So the more important an item is, the more likely the next respondent is to see it in their MaxDiff survey. And so it's continually updated so that respondents are disproportionately seeing the more important things, but they're still seeing the unimportant things fairly often, to give them a chance. We don't want to run the risk that the first few respondents or the first 50 people that took our survey are a bunch of weirdos. We want later respondents to be able to bring unimportant things back up if they really are important. And this method's been found to work really, really well if you've got a really decent sample size and you've got the opportunity to write this, the kind of questionnaire logic that would allow you to keep revising the survey for subsequent respondents. The remaining 4 methods all rely on more standard survey capabilities. You don't have to write that code that does all that adaptivity. And the first one is called augmented MaxDiff. And what we have here is we have respondents complete a Q-sort task in addition to a short MaxDiff task. And the specific Q-sort task here was a very simple one. Let's say we had 40 items in our MaxDiff. They would have respondents sort the 40 items into 4 buckets. So there would be one bucket that contained the 10 most important, and one bucket that had the next 10 most important, the next 10, and then a final bucket that had the 10 least important. If you think about that kind of data, that kind of Q-sort data, it implies it's a partial rank order. You know that each item in the first bucket is more important than each item in any of the other 3 buckets. And for the second bucket, you know that any item in that bucket is more important than any item in the bottom 2 buckets, and so on. And you can combine that Q-sort data, that partial rank order data, with the data you get from MaxDiff. You put them together, you run HV analysis, and you've got yourself a model. The same authors who came up with that came up with something that they called tailored MaxDiff. And here we include the Q-sort, but now we're going to differentially sample from those buckets or those tiers disproportionately. So let's say we had 40 items, and the Q-sort divides them into 4 tiers of 10 items each. When we put together the MaxDiff, we're going to construct the list of items differently potentially for each person, because if I've taken it and I've got my Q-sort data, it's going to give me all 10 items from my top bucket. It's going to give me 8 of the 10 items from the second bucket, 4 from the third, and 2 from the 4th bucket. So 2 of my least important items, all 10 of my most important items, and it's going to take those, 24 items, and it's going to give me a Q-sort. And then it's going to add the Q-sort data plus the inequalities data. It's going to add the MaxDiff data and the inequalities from the Q-sort, just like in augmented MaxDiff, and it's going to run HV analysis. Hendricks and Drucker, the fellows that came up with these methods, did an empirical study with 40 items, and they found that both of these methods improved predictions over standard MaxDiff. Both also had more positive ratings When they asked people how much they liked the survey, they liked it better. They felt that it was being responsive to them. Tailored MaxDiff was a little bit of a challenge to program, and it seemed to provide no real benefit over augmented MaxDiff. So the authors liked that one better. But I think of this as this is sort of a halfway solution. You know, maybe it works with 40 items, but I've never successfully gotten respondents to do a Q-sort with 100 items. So I don't think it's a solution to really big number of items. I think it's a solution to a kind of big number of items. So Express MaxDiff is designed for an even larger number of items. Basically, we used a two-step experiment. So in the first step of the experiment, let's say we had an experiment with 100 items. So the first step is to create 20 blocks of 30 items each. Each one of those blocks becomes a separate MaxDiff survey that has just the 30 items. So a given respondent sees just one block of questions and then just 30 of the 100 total items. So if I'm taking the survey, I might have one set of 30 items in my MaxDiff, each one of which I'm seeing at least 3 times, so I'm getting good HB data, but everything else I'm seeing 0 times. Whereas another person taking the study sees a different set of 30 items. And what we rely on here is we rely on the hierarchical Bayes' ability to borrow information to stitch everything back together and give us a comparable set of utilities. There's a bit of a leap of faith involved here. Another method is called sparse MaxDiff. And the idea here is, you know, we've always thought that we needed to show each item 3 times to each respondent. What if we relax that? What if we say everybody has to see each item just once? Then we take our 100 items, we create 20 choice sets of 5 items each, so that each respondent sees each item just once, and that's our sparse MaxDiff. Whith and Wolfrath, the fellows that came up, or the folks that came up with these 2 ideas, compared these methods on a set of 60 items, and they also compared them with augmented MaxDiff, and here's what they found. They found that the Q-sort that was involved in augmented MaxDiff, that earlier method we talked about a couple minutes ago, added 3 minutes to the survey. They found that the Express MaxDiff had slightly lower predictive validity, and they had a set of recommendations. They liked using augmented MaxDiff when predictive validity is the most important thing, when it's more important than having a short questionnaire. They said if having a short questionnaire is really important, use sparse MaxDiff, but if the number of items gets really, really huge, use Express MaxDiff. That was their recommendation. When they did their paper, they tested Express MaxDiff's ability to recover a known set of utility, and they found that it worked well. And this whole idea of doing what I call a parameter recovery experiment is an important test of the validity of a method. But they only looked at Express, and I think it would be interesting to compare Express and sparse in terms of their ability to recover known utilities. So I took a commercial study that had 729 respondents. I already knew what those respondents' utilities were for a set of 84 items. So I take those utilities, I add a theoretically appropriate amount of error into them, something called gumble error. So I added some gumble error in there to make my respondents realistic, because we know that respondents don't answer things perfectly, they answer with some error. And so I created an Express MaxDiff experiment, a very comparable sparse MaxDiff experiment. Both of them had the same number of choice sets and the same size of choice sets. And when I ran them, when I looked at the aggregate utilities, the average utilities across the sample, I found that they were virtually identical. Sparse was a little bit more highly correlated with the known utilities than the Express utilities were. And although that difference is highly significant, it's small, 0.99 versus 0.99, basically. When I looked at respondent level utilities and correlated the utilities that these 2 methods came up with versus the known utilities that I already had from my respondents, because I knew them, they were an input into my study, here I find a much larger difference. Express MaxDiff came back with a 0.68 correlation between known and estimated utilities, and sparse was much better off at 0.75. And so here we've got a difference that's highly significant and also large enough to matter. So I guess the answer here is that if you're using aggregate level utilities, if you're just using mean utilities and you don't care about the respondent level stuff, if you're not going to be dividing it into a lot of subgroups or you're not going to be doing segmentation, either one of these methods is fine. But if you are going to be dividing it into subgroups or you are going to be doing segmentation, you're probably better off with the sparse. And we had a second study that basically told us exactly the same thing. Sparse did a little bit better than Express in the aggregate, and very much better at the respondent level. And that takes us to our last set of topics before we do Q&A. When I first saw MaxDiff presented in 1993, I was at a conference and Jordan Louvier was doing the presentation, and he pointed out two ways to use it. What he called it was called best-worst scaling at the time, and he said there's something called best-worst scaling and best-worst conjoint, and so I'll talk about those as well as a third case that's come along. In the subsequent years, they've renamed these things. So Jordan now calls what we've been calling MaxDiff, he calls best-worst case 1. What he used to call best-worst conjoint is now called best-worst case 2. And then there's something that's come up even more recently, best-worst choice-based conjoint, and that's best-worst case 3. And we'll talk about all three of these. There's a nice paper by Flynn and Marley that's in the references section at the end here that differentiates these three and talks about them. And later this month, there's also a book coming out. Jordan's got a book coming out on best-worst scaling that you can buy on Amazon.com if you're interested. And I'm sure, I haven't seen the book yet, got it on order, but I'm sure when it comes out, it'll talk about these three different kinds of best-worst scaling. So we've already spent a lot of time talking about the first one, MaxDiff scaling. It's where we've got a set of objects or a set of items, and we want to prioritize them. Best-worst case 2, which is used to be called best-worst conjoint. In this case, the stimulus is a single conjoint profile. So think about the old-fashioned one card at a time conjoint analysis where we're not having people make choices. We used to have people rate those cards or rank them. Now what we're going to do is we're going to show that card, and we're going to ask respondents to tell us what the best attribute level on that card is and what the worst attribute level is. A benefit, well, we'll get to the benefits in a minute. Here's what the question looks like. So here's a refrigerator concept. It's a Samsung with a freezer on top. It's white and it costs $399. And all we have respondents tell us is which one of these most makes you want to buy the refrigerator and which one of these least makes you want to buy the refrigerator. That's the entire respondent task there. We have them do that obviously several times like we would any other conjoint or MaxDiff experiment. And I see it used a lot in messaging research. So in pharmaceuticals, for instance, almost every bit of pharmaceutical research you see has attributes from six themes or 6 areas: efficacy, safety, side effects, cost, method of action, and administration. And so we might have 8 efficacy messages and 11 safety messages and so on. And the pharma company would like to know which 3 or 4 messages are the top ones that they could go off and talk to their physicians about when they do detailing for new drugs. And efficacy is usually the most important thing, but we don't want to go and say, give 4 efficacy messages that are all different ways of saying the same thing. We probably want to pick one of the efficacy messages and one of the safety messages and one side effect message. And this method allows us to do that. It's really easy to do this kind of experiment in using standard MaxDiff software. We just put prohibitions in to prevent any more than one efficacy message from showing in any one choice question. It's an easy, by way of benefits, this is an easy task for respondents, and what that means is it's a shorter task for respondents than a choice-based conjoint is. And it's been consistently found that this way of doing conjoint analysis has less respondent error in it than choice-based conjoint does. And I'll show you that in a minute. The neat benefit, and the reason you might want to use it sometimes, is it allows us to directly compare the utilities of different levels of different attributes. So if we were doing an automobile study and we wanted to find out, is seating capacity of 4 passengers, how does that compare to a 5-year warranty? If we were doing any other kind of conjoint analysis, a red flag would pop up and it would say, you can't make cross-attribute level comparisons because each attribute is on a different scale with a different origin. We cannot do that. In best-worst conjoint or best-worst case 2 scaling, you can. On the other hand, like I say, nothing comes without a price. Unlike choice-based conjoint, best worst case 2 doesn't allow any of the sexy special effects that we can get with choice-based conjoint. We can't look at interactions, we can't look at cross effects, and we can't look at alternative specific effects. And in my experience, a lot of times we want to look at those sorts of things. So I would say I do this kind of best worst case 2 fairly infrequently, because when I'm doing conjoint analysis, I ordinarily want to have those special effects in there. As well, there's historically been a bit of controversy over whether the utilities from best worst scaling have a composition rule that allows them to be added. Because in order to run simulations like we like to do in our conjoint studies, we have to be able to add the utilities. And so for a lot of years, there's been a concern that maybe the best worst scaling utilities aren't additive. In fact, I think that's one of the things that led Jordan to stop calling best worst case 2 best worst conjoint, because people got all up in arms about, hey, the utilities aren't additive and you can't do this, and don't call it conjoint analysis. And I think finally it just made sense not to. When people have looked at this empirically, what they found is that sure enough, there's a big decrease in response error. Flynn, Peters, and Coast found a 7-fold decrease in response error for their best worst case 2 task relative to a choice-based conjoint. They did, however, find significant differences in parameters. What they found is that the two methods didn't give you the same set of utilities, at least for one of their segments of respondents. With a colleague named Mike Scrappitz, I did some research back in '96 and found the same sort of thing. We found that the best worst case 2 scaling had less response error in it. It produced slightly different model parameters, but they predicted holdouts, albeit unusual holdouts, a little bit better. So it seems that it was worth updating this bit of research. So I did a web-based experiment with a colleague named Jeremy Loscheider on refrigerators. We had 571 refrigerator customers, and we had them do a choice-based conjoint. We had 189 respondents do a choice-based conjoint. We had another 192 respondents do a best worst case 2, a best worst conjoint, a MaxDiff scaling type conjoint. And then we had a holdout sample of 190 respondents that we could use to test which of those worked better. And one thing we saw is this. So all I've done here is I've graphed the choice-based conjoint utilities versus the best worst case 2 utilities. You can see they line up sort of on the diagonal line. Two things to note. Those points are far enough off the line where we would say the two sets of utilities are significantly different. When we run a stats test, we find that those are not the same set of utilities. They're very similar. They're correlated at 0.9 or higher, but they're not identical. The other thing to notice is how much wider the best worst utility scale is. It goes roughly from -2 to +2 almost, actually from about -1.6 to +1.5, whereas the choice-based conjoint utility, the vertical range is narrower. So the slope on that line is less than 1. And that's just a way of saying that's just visual evidence. Because the utilities from the best worst case 2 are larger, there's less response error in the best worst case 2 data than there is in the choice-based conjoint data. When it comes down to the really critical question, is there, can we use this method to make predictions? Can we plug these utilities into a simulator and get good answers? In this case, we did. The best worst case 2 model had a lower mean absolute error of prediction and a higher correlation of, with shares, with holdout shares than the choice-based conjoint did, and that's even though the holdouts were choice-based conjoint holdouts. So that's kind of an impressive finding. We did a second study using high-def TVs, and we again found that this time we found that the choice-based conjoint did a little bit better than the best worst case 2 scaling, but the best worst case 2 didn't do too badly. So I think it's a viable method that we can use. So it's something we should add to our toolbox. I think if you're like me, you'll find that you don't use it very often, but I think it's kind of nice to have in the toolbox anyway. Finally, there's a thing that's called best worst scaling case 3. And what that is basically is a choice-based conjoint with with 3 or more alternatives per set, and we have the respondent choose the best and worst profile. So here's an example. So here we've got, here's our refrigerator study again. We show respondents refrigerators 1 through 4. Each of them differs in terms of 4 attributes. And the respondent gives us a best and worst sort of response. Just like in MaxDiff, which one are you most likely to buy? Which one are you least likely to buy? And then we can run that through our CBC software and get HB utilities and everything else. In an extreme case, we could even get a full rank ordering by asking one additional question. Given that they chose refrigerator 1 as their best and 3 as their worst, of the remaining 2, which one's the best? Oh, it's refrigerator 4, it turns out, for this respondent. If you collect this best worst case 3 data, my colleague Brian Orm wrote a white paper that's up on our website a couple of years ago showing that you could combine best worst case 2 and best worst case 3 data and get kind of the best of both worlds, because you get all the fancy special effects, your cross effects, your alternative specific effects, interactions, and all that business from the best worst case 3. And then from the best worst case 2, you get the idea that all the utilities are directly comparable. So you really get all the strengths of both methods. Kind of a neat thing. And then at the Sawtooth Software Conference in 2008, Jordan Louvier and several co-authors started talking about, hey, you could really, if you collect the full rank order data, there's a way to use this best worst data to come up with individual respondent level utilities that doesn't involve using HB at all. So you can analyze this with standard Logit software, which is potentially kind of neat. That does it for the content I wanted to present. I wanted to point out there's a references section at the end. Some of these are references to papers that were referred to in the slides themselves, and some of them are papers that are referred to in a longer version of this presentation. I think perhaps we'll come back and do an advanced MaxDiff part 2 sort of session in another couple months or something, and we can cover some of those other topics. But I think at this point, it's time for me to turn it over to Megan and do some questions and answers.
Yeah, so we've had a lot of questions coming in, which is probably why I was more quiet during your presentation, Keith, trying to help some people figure some things out. One topic of interest is if you could describe a little bit more about the augmented MaxDiff and how you combine that Q-sort data with MaxDiff utilities, and if you can even do that in our Sawtooth software itself, or if that is within another program.
No, you could do it within Sawtooth Software. You'd have to get out into the, you'd have to use the CBC HB standalone HB software, and you'd have to code the data so that it was similar. What you'd have to do, let's see, so with the Q-sort data, you'd have to create a bunch of new choice sets. Because let's say you had 40 items in bucket 1 and 40 items, and 10 were in bucket 1 and 10 in bucket 2 and 10 in bucket 3. You create some new choice sets where you would be observing each of the items in bucket 1 being preferred to all the items in buckets 2, 3, and 4. So you'd create a bunch of choice sets that would show that. As well, you would create a bunch of choice sets for the items in bucket 2 being preferred to the items in bucket 3 and 4. And then finally for the items in bucket 3 being preferred to the ones in 4. And I suppose there's probably several ways you could do that, right? You could create a really big experimental design in our software and then infer what the respondents' answers would be based on the way they put things in buckets, realizing that you have some that were ties that you'd have to throw away. Or you could create every possible MaxDiff question that would be informed by the way people put things in buckets. So I think you'd have some choices about how to do that. I'd refer you to the paper that's in our conference proceedings to see how the authors did it, because I don't recall offhand exactly how they did it. But it would be doable in the CBCHB software. You know, it would take some Excel reformatting of data and so on, but it wouldn't be I don't think it would be too hard of a thing to do.
Great. Great, thank you. That helps a lot. And you kind of touched on it a little bit, but sometimes if they're doing this Q-sort and then they do the MaxDiff, or maybe if they were in the anchored MaxDiff, their answers may contradict each other. So could you talk about in an anchored MaxDiff, let's say we have them do Lattery's method, right? They go through the MaxDiff exercise, they choose which is best and worst, and then they tell you after which of them were actually important to them. What does the model, can you talk a little bit about the model itself and how it will take care of those instances in which the anchor and the estimates contradict each other?
Wow, you've got those kind of respondents who are contradictory.
I have been yes. Well, you know,
you're not paying enough for your sample. I know.
Those items in the. What about the items in the middle that maybe somebody doesn't know very clearly? You know, that maybe there's a tie, but when they answer the follow-up question, they decide that something actually is important.
You know, and I'm sure, and certainly that happens. We know that our human respondents are inconsistent. That's why even when we simulate respondents on the computer, we add error to them because we know that they're inconsistent. They're not paying attention. They're reading they're looking at YouTube while they're trying to do our survey. Who knows what they're doing while they're doing surveys? But paying attention doesn't seem to be the #1 thing all the time. So you know, MaxDiff, it's built to accommodate that. So when we run the estimates, we get the utilities that best fit the data, and if the respondent has been contradictory, the best fit of that data is going to have more noise in it. Basically, the utilities are going to be smaller. So when people are inconsistent, they tend to have smaller utilities, and respondents who've been very consistent tend to have larger utilities. And
I got a dog.
That's not mine. So anyway, so the software does sort that out, and the way it's going to do that is by shrinking. It's going to do that by shrinking the utilities and being less certain about, less confident about what it's telling you in the utilities.
Perfect. That's great. Now, I've also had a couple people write in about if you had a personal preference, I'm putting you on the spot here, Keith, for the Louvier method versus the Lattery. Now, I know you worked with Lattery, but I know you studied with Louvier, so I'm not sure if you have a preference or if you can even decide.
No, I didn't study with Jordan, but he's actually a very nice fellow who is more than willing to share what he knows and teach people things. He's just a really good teacher. And Kevin's a good friend, so but you're not putting me on the spot. I would go with, depending on the application, but I would say I've more often used Jordan's method than Kevin's. Kevin's just strikes me as being a bit too obvious to me. People just know what's going on. So as long as I have a reasonable number of MaxDiff questions, I would probably use Jordan's method. If I had a large number of MaxDiff questions, you know, 30 MaxDiff questions, at that point I might start thinking about going to Kevin's method just because of the additional length that Jordan's dual response would involve.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, I might disagree. I kind of like Lattery's method, also because I feel like if we're testing a bunch of different items that have a similar connotation, then you're going to get a lot of, in the Louvier approach, you know, some of these are important. So I want to make sure to inform my model with the anchor as well. So sometimes I think Lattery's helps me do that a little more when the items are similar or that it's hard to say if there's a difference and if I like all of them or none of them. So I think it just depends, but both of them are good approaches. So, you know, we will differ on that one a little bit, but I will make sure to consider that in the future. Let's see, last one. I think we have time for maybe a couple more if people want to continue writing in. Let's see here. Sorry, just looking through. Some of the questions came around how sample size for a sparse MaxDiff or an express MaxDiff and things like that. Keith, can you talk through, you know, there are no really hard and fast rules about how much sample you need to get good estimations, but can you talk through how you could actually test your MaxDiff design, maybe run some dummy data through it and look at it that way and what you would look for when you were testing the design?
Yeah, sure. Well, actually, there was a nice paper at our most recent conference, and once the proceedings are online, you'll be able to go and check it out. There was a paper specifically about sample size for MaxDiff. I had never really seen a good paper for that, but there was a really nice treatment of, and it even gave some nice rules of thumb and some little formulas you could use to calculate how much sample you needed if you wanted a certain size margin of error. So it all comes down to how big of a margin of error do you want, how much sample size do you need to get it. And I think that's so that's a really easy way of doing it. If you wanted, if you didn't have access to that easy way, or if you wanted to be even a little bit more accurate, I would create a MaxDiff design. And in our software, we have what's called a test of the MaxDiff design, but really all it does is counts how many times each thing appears and how many times each thing appears with each other thing. What I'd really use is go into the software and generate data for my MaxDiff survey. I might generate, typically I generate 400 responses. And so I'll have 400 random responders go through my survey, and then I'll take that data and I'll analyze it and I'll calculate what my standard errors are. And then so then I'll know the size of my standard errors. And because 400 is kind of a convenient number, because I can say, okay, if I divide that number by 4, if I reduce my sample size by a factor of 4, I know that my standard errors double in size. And so just knowing that relationship between the size of standard errors and the size of sample, I can start to say, well, what size standard error can I live with? What sample size do I need to get that, that standard error? And it helps to know, too, if you're looking at those standard errors, it really helps to know what size utility differences you might be looking for. So you might look to past data and say, well, in the past, I've been able to make, when we've used MaxDiff data, we've made decisions on, differences of about 0.6 in terms of utility. That's great. Once you have that information, then you can figure out what sample size you need to be able to identify differences of 0.6 as significant or not.
Perfect. And actually, Chris Moore told me that that paper that you were referencing was Dmitry Lakovitsky's paper from the conference. So just to give him a little bit of credit there. And then, like Keith said, once those are published, you'll be able to take a look at those. Last question that I have, what about combining anchoring with scores on the fly? Is that even possible? What are your thoughts on that? Has that even been done before?
Wow, that's
pretty cool, right?
Yeah, I anchoring with scores on. I don't know offhand if the software does that for you or not. Let us look into that and get back to you on that one, because I don't know. But it's a neat idea. And scores on the fly aren't something we've talked about, but I've had a lot of fun using those the past couple years, because you can, for those folks who don't know, the MaxDiff software, the software allows us to calculate MaxDiff utilities during the course of the survey. So as soon as someone's done with their MaxDiff survey, we can calculate what their utilities are, and we can use them further on in the survey. So we can find out maybe which item was most important to people, and then we can ask them questions about it. We can ask them open-end questions. I've had clients who use our MaxDiff software in a survey as part of their qualitative research. They'll have respondents do a little MaxDiff. They'll get the utilities on the fly. They'll turn the computer around and show them to the respondent in the one-on-one interview or whatever, and say, this is what the computer is saying that you value. Tell me what's right or what's wrong about it, to use it to start a discussion. So I've seen that on-the-fly data used in a lot of really neat ways.
Great.
But as to combining them with anchors, that's a new one to me. That's a cool idea. We'll have to find out about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, well, since we're about 5 minutes out, we have a couple of questions here, and I will try to respond to you via email and talk with Keith about some of them. They're a little bit more complex for answering during the webinar, but thanks everyone for joining. I will remind you that we have a couple of choice modeling workshops coming up. One's in Park City, October 5th through 7th of this year, and during those workshops, we actually go over MaxDiff as well as choice-based conjoint and even ACBC. And there are a couple of other training events throughout the year, and one that's just planned for winter in Florida, February 1st through 5th, which is jam-packed full of a lot of information. And if you're not familiar with the Turbo Choice portion of the conference, Keith will actually be leading that, and that is just chock full of really interesting topics, as well as includes presentations and a discussion from a panel of some of the big names at our conferences, including Tom Eagle and David Lyon and Kevin Lattery, Chris Moore, and as well as some of our peers, Aaron Hill and Brian Orm will be there too. So if you have any questions about those workshops or if you have any follow-ups from this presentation, feel free to email myself or Keith. And in a couple of hours here, once we tie up the webinar recording and the presentation, we will be sending those along for you. And we appreciate your attendance, and feel free to give us a shout out and some feedback. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.